Hi, everyone. This is going to be a continuation of our series on famous quotes on Paul. And the person we're looking at is the historian Edwin Johnson, who wrote a work in 1894 about Paul entitled The Pauline Epistles, Restudied and Explained. And this part one is going to be Paul is invisible in the earliest quotes in the church from 70 AD to 207 AD. That's when you put all the pieces together that he mentions, this is what you would come up with. And just so you know, he's a literary critic. So he is basically saying, where is the evidence, literary wise, documents and so on, to validate certain things. And so he raises kind of unique perspective on questions about Paul. But at the same time, he is looking at the scarcity of the records about Paul, and this is in 1894. And really, the only thing that changed is we found something around 200 A.D. P46, which are basically the epistles of Paul in a single collection. So it basically validated they existed as of 200 A.D., but still nothing earlier than that validates it existed prior to that time. No quotes from it. Uh, so you may have Clement mentioning it in his first epistle. He'll talk about the epistles of Paul, but he doesn't quote anything. So we don't know or have any traction to understand that anybody is reading the same epistles that we're reading. So we cannot validate it that way. And so this is a literary critic who's saying, what can we validate given that? So he's very strict using literary standards of how you determine literature. So now I don't think that's always the way to do it. So I'm just putting him out there, but he mentions very important things that we need to know and keep in mind as we read works that claim to be criticizing Paul or affirming Paul, and when this happens and why and so forth. So he is going to uh, show that Paul is invisible in a literary sense from 70 AD to 207 AD, and he's going to say it's a very remarkable fact. All right, so here's the first quote from Johnson. The discovery that led me first to see the enormous fictions that had been at work in the Christian literature, for it is absurd to suppose that Paul, after making a vast reputation as a literary man in the first century, was afterwards almost lost in oblivion in the second century. So, in other words, if you have someone who's written 13 writings and these have been spread all over, allegedly, the Mediterranean, and nobody has any record or mention of them in any writing, secondary writing, in that entire time until you get into after the second century, meaning that means inside the 200s. So this is so you have to know that when you're in the 100s, you're in the second century. So he's saying up through the 100s, there's no quotations of Paul. It begins in the 207 period when Marcion is being battled, and there are now works by Tertullian that mention Paul's writings and quotes them. Next, at page 84 of that work, he says, in another remarkable passage, Pearson and Neighbor say, quote, no one can readily deny that from the first ages the Christian religion was by no means developed according to the rule of the opinions which are believed to have been in the first instance proper to Paul. We never see what the epistles to the Galatians affected. The church and theology itself ignore Paul. Must we not hence conclude that he never existed, who nowhere appears? Are we to believe that the labors of Paul could perish, leaving no vestige behind them? End of quote. And then Edwin Johnson comments, I cannot but regret that these able scholars did not endeavor to explain to themselves such an anomaly and absurdity of literary history. Remember, he's the literary historian. If Paul is not fully known in the second century, as he certainly is not, he is discernible in no following age before the revival of letters. So he's basically saying this is a complete wipeout, a complete blank, and then you don't get any real attention to him for a long period of time after that. But we do know there is some works in Latin that didn't get translated until 1999, and that is a commentary of Ambrose on the epistle to the First Corinthians. So and also I also on Galatians. So we have something there. It's not completely a wipeout. So I would say this though, what this does reflect is that Paul is an unknown figure, and this goes in with what we were saying earlier in our other series on 119 Ministries. How do we know that Paul was known by uh, James or by Peter or Luke when they're writing Acts? Luke is writing Acts, when Peter's writing Second Peter, and when James is writing his epistles, or confronting Paul in Acts 21. We have no idea. So if it's true that there's no record even Paul having written anything until in terms of quotations that we can pin down and say, okay, we know the book of Romans exists and so on. We are simply without literary evidence to document what that person, what we are speculating James thinks or knows, and we're speculating that Luke knows about, or what Peter knows about. It's pure speculation because we don't even have records from that era that anyone even knew of any of Paul's epistles per se by a quotation that would pin down what it was, what book or work it was. So that is very important material for purposes of Christians knowing what we can and cannot say and what we cannot prove or infer from what we read, particularly in the book of Acts, and then infer some knowledge that somebody has that we cannot establish by any literary means. Here's his next quote in the same line, page 46. Take the richest theological epistle ascribed to Paul, that to the Romans. Positively, these so-called post-apostolic men do not know it. And he's talking about Irenaeus and so on. In this period in the up to the end of the 100s, before we get to the 200s. Nobody seems to know about it, even though there's writers in that time period. They have merely some faint echoes of its contents, which is a very different thing, and it is the merest sophistry to confound them or to talk of reminiscences where there is no proof of anything of the kind. I must distinctly warn my readers against this fallacy of the handbooks and introductions to the New Testament, the only thorough cure for which is to read the post apostolic men for themselves. They will then discover that these writers, assumed to be following in the steps of their forerunners and to the diligently perusing their writings as we have them, are doing nothing of the kind. They're dreaming, rambling, and raving, but they do not know the romantic figure of Paul that is known to us, nor yet his alleged writings as we have them. So, yes, he's right. You can look at it, the first century works in the 100s like Ignatius, Irenaeus, and so on, Irenaeus, uh, Papias, although he's being quoted in secondary sources because his works have been lost. I mean, there is no evidence of what Paul's writings were that they even knew about or that they even were reading them. He completely disappears from the face of history, except in the Marcion movement. But those works, all the Marcion records, are completely destroyed too. They're all gone, and the only way to reconstruct anything about the Marcionites is from a book written in 207 AD by Tertullian, who then quotes Marcion's works, and then Tertullian then quotes against Marcion's constructions, what Paul actually writes or what Jesus actually says, and things like that. So you have a very big gap where you have no literary evidence that the people in the first century had any knowledge other than the communities who received the epistles that Paul was addressing, like the Galatians or the Romans or whatever. Presumably, those people in a church in that single area knew of what he was writing, but you cannot infer anyone else knew, particularly because in five of them, there's clear apostasy. There's Ephesians, Colossians, Romans, First Corinthians, and Galatians, of course, most of all. So you have multiple works that all would be justification to give Paul a death penalty if the Roman law didn't protect Paul as a Roman citizen. He could not be executed in Rome, executed in a Roman province. He would at most be punished or penalized or whatever, but he would not ever be killed. So he was able to get away with apostasy inside of Judea, which would have been a crime in any other era. So anyway, that is why this is such an important series of quotes we just got. So he's reminding people on a literary basis, nothing explains why the people writing the 100s know nothing about Paul. Got it dating to the 100s, and so that's the earliest writing we have of a comprehensive nature. Agnes Lewis, it's called the Syriac Sinaiticus, or the Sinaiticus Syriac. I call it the Syriac Sinaiticus. And then you had the Curitan manuscript that's very similar, found in a similar region in the Sinai. So anyway, that's very interesting that he's looking at this very thin, very unanalytical, and he says really poorly reasoned out works in the what is written in the 300s to make it look like they're in the 200s. Now I'm going to say this: he can be forgiven what he's saying because what you can see for a fact, take the example of Origen. Origen is writing in the 220s. Okay. We now know, we didn't know for a long time, that the Origen we're reading in the 1500s onward was a corruption, a complete rewrite and throwing away of the original Greek works of Origen. And Rufinus, shamelessly, he put in a preface saying, I'm going to make this sound like it's not going to be shocking to Latin ears. And so he literally rewrote what he didn't like and made it sound purely Trinitarian. And he's writing in the 380s, 390s, and you've got Origen who's living in the 220s, and he doesn't even know of a Trinity yet, right? So all these things are being put in his mouth, and so you can just you got to forgive Mr. Edwin Johnson for saying what he's saying, but he's right. He didn't know yet. At this point we hadn't yet discovered all the writings of Origen, and we've have a lot of fragments that have come up, and we can see that where the text was originally Origen, and then you can tell what's not there is the new stuff that was added by Rufinus in his fraudulent endeavor to make it appear the Trinity existed 200 years before it was ever even thought about. So anyway, let's go on here. Okay. It was found necessary, and it was determined to write not only the little Gospels and the little epistles to the service book, but to provide what should appear as a new law or new covenant or New Testament independently in ampler bulk. But in executing this work, which was the secondary stage in their labors, they forgot that they were thus making the scheme top heavy, as it were. The head is highly developed, but has the most ghostly kind of body to support it. So what he's saying is, wow, you've got all this great detail when you look at the epistles and you look at the Gospels. There's all this detail, and then you've got these very weak authors, very superficial, very unanalytical people, and so that's a matter of opinion. But if you read all his work, you'll see he thinks they're not heavyweights. Let's put it that way, and it looks like somebody's a monk sitting there writing them and fraudulently creating them to make them all look like they existed in an earlier period of time. And again, you can forgive him because there's clear evidence that happened in the case of Origen. And I have not investigated how many other writers that we think are classical writers were actually rewritten in the 390s, but that's what he notices. And he's a literary critic. Remember, that's his job, is to look at when was something actually written versus when it wasn't. And you can tell that how could Origen be talking about a Trinity that doesn't come into existence until 381 AD? That's when the Trinity, the Holy Spirit, was added as the third God in a Godhead. Up to that time, it was two gods in a single Godhead since 325 AD. So how could Origen, writing in 220, be talking about a Trinity in the exact same terms as they were talking about in the 300s, when it was much more developed? So, and nobody ever cited Origen in the debates on the Trinity prior to the 390s. So, how can he be ignored when this is so fundamental for the dispute that allegedly is going on in the church? All right, one last quote. To show, and this is Edwin Johnson, to show my readers how absurd the received notions about the Pauline epistles and the rest of the New Testament books truly are, this very Tertullian, with all his volubility and his declamation about Marcion, does not show that he has the Pauline epistles as a closed collection and in a fixed order in his own hands. So, can you imagine this? Is you're looking at, and he has a whole book. We're going to go into that in the next series of his quotes, in a famous quotes episode 10.2. If you look there, Tertullian, I believe, will quote what Marcion says Paul said, but he never really says what Paul actually says. He just takes and runs with whatever Marcion says. And I'll go back and look at it again over time, and I'll tell you if I see any change in that. But I think he's right. Marcion never is being said to have misquoted Paul, and so Tertullian is not telling us what he has in his hands at all. Now, Tertullian does see some quotes of Luke in the Gospel that is being quoted by. So there you go. You got all four Gospels by Marcion that is mismatching the Gospel of Luke that is in Tertullian's hand. So we can affirm what Tertullian had in 207 AD is a gospel that looks a lot like Luke. However, in some instances, that's also been changed, in particular when it came to the virgin birth and the fact that Mary thought her own son had lost his mind. That's in Tertullian's commentaries, okay? Well, that means Mary had never had this experience of a virgin birth. Where did that come from? Because why would she think her son's gone crazy when he wants to go do his mission, begin his mission at Capernaum? And that is still in the book of Mark, by the way. And it's hidden by retranslating in such a way that, it just says he's outside his mind or something like that. But go read that in the book of Mark. It's still there. And Matthew was completely neutered, it all completely eviscerated, but it was there originally too. So you've got uh, uh, the Gospels are different than Paul's epistles. Paul's epistles are virtually unknown, and therefore he's saying that Marcion's the only source of Paul's writing is what Marcion is saying, and Tertullian is not challenging how they read. Only when it's quotations from the Gospel of Luke does uh, Tertullian have any basis to look at something in his hands and say, here's what reads differently. Do you see the point? So you can infer from just reading Tertullian's against Marcion that Tertullian does not even have any epistles in his hands of Paul, which is striking to write a book called Against Marcion, who is allegedly taking Paul out of context or whatever. So, but he doesn't go that way. He never addresses and says, well, you've taken Paul out of context. You don't understand him. In fact, what I would say is there's a whole section where Tertullian debunks all the doctrines of Marcion, and they're all the doctrines we know of today as Pauline doctrine, predestination, salvation by faith alone, and all these things. He debunks all of them, and he tosses them in the trash. So what do we have to say to that? Right? So we've got an election I should put in there as well. So what do you have left? You've got a gospel of Luke, and you have the doctrines of Paul in the mouth of Marcion, but you have no mention by Tertullian that he knows what Paul writes differently. So, for example, if Tertullian is really saying all those things I said to you, and I have a whole chapter in my book, Jesus' Words Only, where I take all these quotations and I show you in categories that match the Pauline way of looking at things, the title, predestination, and doctrines of salvation, and so on. And he criticizes all this stuff, and he never mentions what Paul says being equal or not equal. See? So wouldn't you presume, I'm going to just throw this out, wouldn't you presume that if he thought Paul was teaching the same thing as this heretic, and literally he's summarizing doctrines that are identical, if you look at Paul, is he aware that he's criticizing Paul indirectly? Or does he not even have the epistles of Paul, and he is criticizing Marcion for his doctrines being so perniciously evil, such as they really are, even when you read them in Paul? They're still perniciously evil. Predestination of good and evil, that you have no voluntary control whether you're going to sin or not. It's all in God's hand that you'll sin. I mean, that's how Paul can be read, and that's what Marcion was reading, and so on and so forth. And again, I think this is a proof positive that Edwin Johnson is on something. That why doesn't even Tertullian, who's battling the Marcionites over Paul being the sole apostle, and he never says that they're taking him out of context, they're misquoting him or anything, because he doesn't have the epistles. He's in Carthage, Africa. He's where Augustine lives, the same place where Augustine is going to live in the future, and he has nothing, and yet he's writing, and he can popularly get on ships there. There's lots of boats traveling between Carthage and Rome. He can get on there and go to Rome, go to libraries, look at the Gospels, look at the epistles, but he never does anything like that. I'm pretty sure. So I'm going to double check when I get a chance. But I've read 5 times the Against Marcion, so I'm pretty sure I don't remember any quote like that. So this is what Edwin Johnson is saying. So this is a big deal, everybody. I mean, a real big deal, that Paul is invisible, and even his epistles are not circulating, even by a guy who's trying to defend Christianity from a guy who's relying completely on Paul's writings. And Tertullian, is crushing everything that Marcion is saying. And when you read Paul, they're the same doctrines. So could he possibly have really had Paul's writings in front of himself? I don't think so. I think he would have been a little more circumspect not to attack the doctrines that are Pauline, right? All right, everybody. God bless. I hope that helps. And you're going to see a very interesting next episode on famous quotes of Paul with Edwin Johnson quoting the work of Tertullian against Marcion. One last slide is at page 50. To show my readers how absurd the received notions about the Pauline epistles and the rest of the New Testament books truly are, this very Tertullian, with all his volubility and his declamation about Marcion, does not show that he has the Pauline epistles as a closed collection and in a fixed order in his own hands. So we can look at against Marcion, and you can detect that he doesn't have any writings of Paul in his custody, and they may not even appear to him to be the same as we see today, because he's going to attack viciously Marcion's views as apostate, as evil, and all this kind of stuff without any hesitancy of thinking, well, this is going to boomerang on Paul. It's as if he doesn't know Paul holds the same views as Marcion. So I go through in my book, Jesus Words Only, I go through quote after quote of Tertullian attacking the standard doctrines of Paul, election and predestination, all this kind of stuff as evil and as immoral, just using common sense kind of approach. And so you have to wonder, if he had in his custody all these epistles of Paul that say the same thing, would he have not pulled his punch? Meaning, don't hit back at don't hit Marcion in such a way that it's going to boomerang and hurt Paul, if that's somebody you think is true, as somebody you need to defend and protect. So he does nothing like that, which suggests potentially that he doesn't have the epistles of Paul, so they're not circulating. And he also maybe had a different version of Paul's epistles. It's never obvious that he has any of Paul's epistles to say in any respect. For example, I'm going to correct something that Marcion said. So Marcion quotes Paul saying this, but he doesn't say that. So that's how I would say what this is Edwin Johnson's point, is that there is no evidence that Tertullian has the corpus of Paul's epistles and what they're in and what the names of them are and what order, and you would expect it in a book where the opponent is saying, I only follow these particular works of Paul, and he has a couple of extras, Laodicean, the epistle to the Laodiceans, and a couple of others, or one other, and he also subtracts a couple. So you would think that the number one thing that Tertullian would do is say, well, you've included epistles that aren't his, and you failed to include epistles that are his. We see no accounting that normally would be expected in this work. So this does undermine the fact that there was any kind of standard corpus of Paul's epistles, and even what they were. And it undermines maybe that they even had all the content we see today, because, as I said, uh, Tertullian is just aggressively going after Marcion's teachings as false, but we can see they evidently also come from Paul. So it's really ironic, and it's unmistakable. All right. Anyway, I think that's going to be it. And so we have another episode on famous quotes on Paul using Edwin Johnson quoting Tertullian's against Marcion, and you'll find that very fascinating, because it's a very let's put it this way. When anyone who believes in Paul has a serious problem when they listen to Tertullian's critique, because it's very analytical and systemic, and wipes out Paul's authority as an apostle. All right. God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.